A very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Mills. I'm a Senior Associate at the Zien Group, and I'd like to welcome you all to a webinar on investment opportunities to use science to make land use sustainable. Now, I'm joined by Professor Jim Lynch, the Distinguished Professor of Life Sciences Emeritus from the Centre for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Surrey. Jim is a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry, the Royal Society of Biology, the Royal Geographical Society and the Royal Society of Arts. He's also a chartered chemist, scientist and environmentalist. He was awarded the UNESCO Prize in Microbiology and the Einstein Medal, and is a freeman of the City of London and a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Scientific Instrument Makers. Now, as always, the agenda for this webinar is very simple. Following my brief introduction, Jim is going to make his presentation, and then we're going to move on to the Q&A discussion. Now, I'm afraid that you're all muted, but you are able to submit your questions through the chat tool, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. Please do chip in at any point of the proceedings. I'm going to be collating your questions, and I'm going to put them to Jim at the end. Now, we're going to be recording this session, and you will be able to access the presentation and discussion at a later date. Without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker. Jim, tell us about investment opportunities to use science to make land use sustainable.
Thanks very much, Simon. Yeah, as you said, I'm in the Worshipful Company of Scientific Instrument Makers. Probably the best of the London livery companies. It is good fun, incidentally, and we do practical science. You can't do practical science without instruments. So if you move to the next slide, please. If we move to the next one, please. Yeah, yes, there we go. Right, so I wrote a book in 2023, and the reason I put the cover, the front and back cover on here, is to show science, which is what I'll base this on. On the left-hand side, on the back cover, is a satellite image, which as a microbiologist for the last 10 or 12 years or so, I've been able to stray into that area, looking at imagery from space and trying to link it to an extent to what's happening on the right. On the right is the modern picture, modern microscopy of a microbiome. I've just defined a new discipline called rhizomicrobiomics, which will be published in the Journal of Sustainable Microbiology, which tries to link Earth observation to looking at what's happening actually on the ground and what happens at the level of the microbiome. Now, how does this affect the ways we can move forward? Next slide, please. What I will try to cover is the important aspect that a lot of our land globally is subject to deforestation, and that has an impact on climate change and trade. There is a nominal international instrument called REDD, Reduction of Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, trying to reduce carbon emissions. But I tend to like to put this in the context of how land is being used and some of the alternative strategies from forestry, biofuels, precision farming and agroforestry, and then try to come to conclusions where new directions that we might go. Next slide, please. So that's the world as we know it, globe, and that's the if that were the normal world. If you move to the next slide, please. That's the world when we look at it in terms of forest loss. You can see the two continents that are most prone to this is South America, particularly Amazonia, but also Africa. So that is the problems. It doesn't mean to say we don't have problems outside of those main target zones, but that just gives a perspective of where the principal targets are. Next slide, please. So a lot of the problem on deforestation has been due to illegal logging. It doesn't mean that legal logging is not a problem. It can be if it's not managed properly. But just the illegal logging is worth up to 30 to $100 billion yearly. And that accounts for 15 to 30% of the global forest production and can be 59% of tropical producers. So that's a lot of trees being lost. But importantly, economically, it depresses the price of timber by about 16%. So the city needs to be interested in that sort of thing. But also, from the social dimension, particularly 1.2 billion people, or about a fifth of the world's population, depend on forests for their livelihood. I spent a spell as chief executive of the Forestry Commission Research Agency, and then I spent 6 years on the board of the European Forest Institute. We introduced a program called FLECT, where we tried to generate instruments by agreement with the presidents of countries to try and enforce the way in which we stop illegal logging. Next slide, please. So this just shows it from space what it looks like. This is the old type of imagery. The resolution is about 22 meters, Landsat 25 meters. And that just shows in Amazonia, the red is forested areas. If we move to the next slide, please. That was in 2011, not that far after it. And you can see all the blue areas. That's in Rodzina, where the blue areas is where there's been deforestation. It's been extensive in Amazonia. This Brazilian Space Agency, INPE, have been really hot on monitoring this. That doesn't mean to say they've not been through a bad period with their president, when Bolsonaro, when he was in power, in not preventing this, and also a lot of international interference, particularly from the US at the time. Next slide, please. Importantly, when we use the satellite image, and this comes down again to scientific instrumentation, none of the satellite imagery is that useful unless you can make it through ground truthing as returned. This gives a picture in that same area that you were seeing there. We always need to check if it's real. Whatever we're trying to measure from space, and we can measure all sorts of extra things now, and I'll be talking about this later, about biodiversity and things. We always need to truth the thing on the ground. And generally speaking, we can get some very good measures. Next slide, please. So the RED system set up during the various COP meetings, we've had so many of these now, they started in Rio, is trying to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in these developing countries, and trying to conserve and sustainably manage the forest and keep the carbon stocks in those developing countries. Next slide, please. Now, this just gives one paper, which I think is quite a classic paper. They've been obviously subsequent one. This was in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It was out of Stanford, Sachi and colleagues, where they use on their satellite imagery, they use a LiDAR system, which is particularly good in doing inventories. And you can get the heights of trees, and you can spatially model. This was some of the early attempts, really, using artificial intelligence and to look at the modeling and uncertainty of how much carbon stock there is there. Next slide, please. This gives a picture then of the above ground biomass globally that we can get from those figures in space. And you can see that the real opportunity in terms of biomass is again in Central Africa and in the Amazonia areas, but there's plenty of other areas as well where there's opportunity. Scientifically, the important thing is as we start to use relatively simple algorithms now with AI movement at such a speed. Next slide, please. We can convert that above ground biomass into the actual amount of carbon, because that's what we want to know. As we move towards the potential of carbon trading, we need to be able to determine how much carbon is actually contained there, and in terms, and then put a value on it. Next slide, please. There's a slight snag. There's a sort of unreliability in measurements. That's the sort of thing when we say about scientific instrument makers, because AI is really important in scientific instrumentation now, is we need to try and reduce the degree of uncertainty on what we're measuring. And this paper was a really honest one, showing just which areas we can be more reliable. And that's been one of the things that's really halted some of the development in terms of the opportunities, trying to get reliable figures under what we know as MRV, monitoring, reporting and verification. Next slide, please. So MRV is at the center of this. If we want to do something about this, if we want to be scientifically satisfied, but also give the investment opportunity, we need good MRV systems. We need good satellite, and we need to be able to interpret them and link that to the environmental. What we also need to do, we need to have teams of this as we move forward. We need to look at the social dimension. When I talk about illegal logging, some of that illegal logging, and I know particularly in Africa, in an area which I'll be talking about in a moment, we get, with the reliability of satellite imagery now, we can see single trees being felled. But sometimes that can be for poor village communities trying to make a subsistence living out the tree. Now, when you recall that in contrast to some of the areas that are being cleared, particularly in Amazon, where the big agricultural interests convert into soya, for example, that's a rather different approach. But there's lots of other issues that need to be pulled together on this, the legal, financial and governance issues, as we try to put packages together. Next slide, please. Now, I'm associated as chief scientist with the company CO2 Eco, which has been trying to bring these various things together, and particularly in Amazon rainforest recovery. There's an Amazon community here in this picture. Next slide, please. It's a planet-sized problem, and commercial solutions are needed. We need to look at the indigenous community. We need to look at just what the details are in terms of how they're using the land. But importantly, we need to look at the commercial and the non-commercial aspects of that carbon which is captured and whether it can be traded. And so what we need is a different type of financial way forward. Next slide, please. So the CO2 Eco situation is trying to give a triple win, if you like, for corporate investors. So making sure that we work with indigenous people in terms of government. So we co-lead this with the commercial. And importantly, what the CO2 Eco view is that we need to look in the long term, and we need to obtain carbon credits for 10, 20, 30 years to give a guaranteed return to investors. And we also need to ensure then that we have a satisfactory system in place that will genuinely sustain that indigenous community. In the original plans on the RED Plus system, the last point was always crucial: sustaining indigenous communities. Now, what you need is to pull these things together. Next slide, please. To make and to enable the success. So you need both short-term, well, you need a long-term investment ultimately, but you need short-term investors to do feasibility studies to put these various things together, which are now all possible using the MRV systems that we've got. The science is there. We have got various organizations that can verify, companies like Vera, which didn't receive a very good press in the Panorama program relatively recently, because there's always going to be some potential complications. So you need absolute honesty as we move forward in these things. And we need to look at ways where we can improve and track the record. And so the investors that need to come into this need to be able to fund a little bit up front to make sure we've got the right strategy, but then also to look at the long-term opportunity. Next slide, please. All these things are very much consistent with the UN Sustainability Development Goals. It ticks so many of the boxes. You've all seen these pictures of the different colors and the way in which, sustain. I mean, this is still 17 very good opportunities. And I think this, by adopting this sort of approach, this gives us a real opportunity to go forward under those UN principles. Next slide, please. Now, this is a project that at Surrey that we're doing, and these are slides by one of my colleagues, Anna Andrews. We're working together with Belmont University in the United States, funded by the Templeton Foundation, which is a religious foundation, but invested in this sort of science. And we're looking at the Budongo forest in Uganda. Now, one of the opportunities that's been seen there is one way in which we can use land is ecotourism. That can bring to these countries, can generate quite a lot of income. What we don't want is a commercial development of that kind without, we must ensure there's no damage to the environment, both in terms of how much carbon there is there, but also the biodiversity. So this is the areas that we've been looking at. What's also important is that the ecotourism can foster sort of small startup companies. For example, I think there's as many as 10 at the moment associated with Budongo Forest, which gives actual employment to some of these people in these indigenous communities. Next slide, please. And this just shows our initial assessments on the total carbon that's stored. There's edge effects around the forest. We're just about to start a program doing ground truthing in Uganda to try and make sure that we're developing a good package that everybody will benefit from. And hopefully we'll be able to take this forward as an example as to how to get commercial gain, but commercial gain at the investor level, but also for the indigenous community. Next slide, please. This, we're talking about Africa and South America, but we should also recognize that these opportunities are opportunities anywhere. This is some the early work where satellite imagery has been used to show patches, those different images. The yellow package shows water uses and the blue one shows nitrogen use. Why should we go irrigating throughout a whole field if it doesn't need it? Why should we put nitrogen everywhere if not all the field needs it? Satellite imagery can give you very good understanding how you can manage the environment much more successfully by applying your water, your nitrogen, any other fertilizer, and pesticides as well. We can get a really good picture. That's a map of the UK. We've been to India and looked at real opportunities and trying to predict when crops might fail as a consequence of the conditions that are present. Next slide, please. Now, one of the ways you could use land is you could use it to produce energy. There's been a lot of false starts. Initially, there was a view in the States, in the Trump area particularly, where you could use corn for biofuel, but that immediately increases the corn prices enormously and compromises the supply of animal feed. And so you always need a life cycle assessment on what the opportunity is on using land for bioenergy. I coordinated the OECD activities for over a few years looking at this, where we decided LCA, life cycle assessment, is critical if we're going to go down the bioenergy route. But just to give you some examples of where you can gain ground. Next slide, please. This is in Ghana that we visited, using combined heat and power. And this is, we managed to provide some burners because a lot of Africa are still dependent on burning for their energy and power. Next slide, please. A lot of oil palm has been used, but there's an alternative. Jatropha oil is potentially a better option and less environmentally damaging. And so we identified areas, and that's where we were able to supply these burners from an EU grant on how people might more effectively produce the bioenergy crop. Next slide, please. During that same program, which was funded by the EU, this happens to be in Namibia, and this shows the coastal areas, which can be quite red, and that's because they carry an alga. It's called Daniela, which is bright red, and because of the salt stress on the alga, 95% of its biomass can be glycerol. Now you say, well, glycerol might not be that useful, but you can actually modify the diesel engine to burn glycerol. Now you've got all that sitting, and it could just be harvested. I'm just trying to say, no one's ever really put significant investment in this, but this could be an opportunity. If we move, next slide, please. Agroforestry is another way to go. We shouldn't just think of the conventional cropping or conventional trees. Next slide, please. And this is from iCraft in Kenya. It gives some of the global land use. This gives a spread on how we might be able to use land. Natural forests are still the biggest area where we could move to some degree of agroforestry in terms of an opportunity to develop. Next slide, please. The types of things that they can do is produce from trees, for example, trees for people. That can be fruit, can be firewood, medicine. We know there's plenty of it. I'm just reviewing a book at the moment produced by Kew. 60 important trees. A lot of them are used for medicine. You know, this is where we got Taxol from the yew tree, for example, is one of the examples where medicine has benefited enormously from capitalizing on some of the trees. So obviously there's the whole wood situation, and some can be used in fodder. Important thing is to look at soil fertility and how carbon is being sequestered, because we mustn't have a situation where we get significant soil erosion. That's always going to be a problem. When I was in the forestry, I was horrified to see how we planted Sitka spruce everywhere in Scotland, and we had the flow country debate, which destroyed a lot of the land. We need to look at watershed protection, as that's an important function of trees, how they shade in a question of climate change, but the biodiversity is really key as we move forward. Next slide, please. And this just gives some of those nice opportunities that people often forget about. And it's not just in Africa that these things, I mean, there are globally lots of places where trees can produce useful products. Next slide, please. And the important thing is as well, this is in Tanzania, celebration. But in East Africa, there's been a lot of effective tree planting done by communities, and particularly women have been involved. And it's been interesting. A lot of the groups that I've spoken to, there are real opportunities to break down gender barriers and engage the whole community. Next slide, please. And so you do this by increasing flow of information and innovation materials among farmers to improve their livelihoods. So you benefit women and the poor, and make sure they're cost effective, sustainable, and the whole thing is that they're accountable to their clients and strengthen the local capacity. Next slide, please. Now, there's new opportunities. Where might we be able to go? Well, one of the things we can do when we use the satellite is to use the concept of normalized difference vegetation index. And that can indicate the health of the crop or the tree from that satellite imagery. We can combine that with the new area of the rhizome microbiome, which is a new topic which I've just described, I mentioned earlier, which will be published very shortly in Sustainable, which uses a molecular analysis of the microbial population around roots. That in the same way as satellite imagery has decreased in cost enormously, the cost of omic analysis, biomic analysis has decreased enormously as well. And providing we do the ground truthing, we can get a whole new picture. It's really close with the advancement of artificial intelligence and machine learning. We can actually develop these quickly, and we can also then produce tipping point analysis mathematically. We can do tipping point analysis to which areas are vulnerable, which might go down, and which communities might suffer as a consequence. Could be disease, could be wind, could be nutrients, anything. Next slide, please. So actually, we are moving to the concept where money can grow on trees. It can be there for investors. It can be there to benefit the communities. And so we can take them out of poverty. And so in terms of the commercial opportunity, there's ethical investment. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we can, I hope I've showed very, very briefly, I mean, satellite imagery now is so great. We can go down quite easily to 0.3 of a meter, and it's not that expensive. That's the type of resolution. We use the ground data and produce these algorithms, which will give us the carbon, the biomass. We have formula now which can give sensible carbon credits, and these, as I say, particularly it looks good if you do it for the long-term investment. And what we need to look at that, and I mentioned this in relation to, say, the bioenergy situation, food security is just one component of sustainable land use. We need to look at the holistic picture. Food security is critical as the way in which we use land, but we need to bring everything together. And if we're going to go down the fuel route at all, absolutely crucial, as with any others, but with life cycle assessment needs to be important. And agroforestry is something that we should be considering. And we need to be optimistic, I think, on ethical investment. It's been challenging. I think perhaps the political arena has not always been right, both nationally and internationally. But I've been an eternal optimist for a long time now. But I am now increasingly optimistic as we try to move forward. And I think the UK can really set a lead, particularly out of the city. So I think I'll conclude there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jim. That was absolutely fascinating. I really love talking about trees. There's an Italian proverb that says you should plant a cherry tree for yourself, an olive tree for your son, and a chestnut tree for your grandson. Now, I can see we've got a lot of questions from our audience, but as the chairman, the privilege of asking the first one falls to me. Jim, the destruction of the environment is led by the tragedy of the commons, and I do have to stress that is the commons of William Foster Lloyd and Garrett Hardin, not the esteemed and entirely trustworthy collection of ladies and gentlemen we've recently elected to office. What does the new Labour government need to do to monetize natural services and try and overcome this?
Well, I think it's a really good question, Simon. We need to have policy generated which is consistent. We have a new excellent scientific minister, Patrick Vallance, who has a good track record in this direction. He may come from the medical background himself, but he's showed a great deal of empathy with the environment. I go to several meetings where he's been speaking. What we need then is consistent policy. We need to, we have a relatively good system in place where we've got UKRI has got the wherewithal to deliver finance, but we must listen increasingly to advice, scientific advice. You must have evidence-driven policy. Often evidence-driven policy, we saw this during pandemic times, scientific evidence wasn't always listened to as rigorously as it might be. We need to take the scientific evidence in driving our policy, and once we've got a satisfactory policy, when we're looking at environmental issues, we need to be able to keep that going. Timing becomes crucial. Not pull out of it, having started it 1 year and a year or two later pull out. So we need consistency, I would say, is the key.
Now, we have some absolutely fascinating questions here. Let's start with an easy ball. Here we are. Some of the most environmentally degraded landscapes are in the northern hemisphere. What can be done to stem and improve degradation of temperate rainforests across Europe and Eurasia?
Well, that's a really good question, actually, Simon. I alluded earlier to the fact that I spent 4 years as CEO of the Forestry Commission Research Agency, and I was well aware that in Scotland there was extensive land degradation because of monocultures of Sitka spruce. That produces a lot of biomass very quickly. The timber is interesting in this new book by Kew. They're in praise of Sitka, but it did a lot of damage. A lot of soil erosion took place as a consequence.
And of course, you've got the allophane compounds pumping aluminium into water courses as well.
Exactly. But what we need to look at the opportunity for more mixed cropping, mixed stands. We need to look at the balance between broadleaf and conifer plantations. For example, Britain was founded on production of oak. That's how we got our. I've just had this experience myself. I have a house which is partly constructed of oak, needs some rebuilding. Getting British oak at the moment is incredibly expensive, and there's not much of it. I'm having to go to France, as we normally do. We get it considered. So we need a better policy on planting and management. And the idea that we simply need to produce biomass from a non-indigenous species like Sitka needs to be questioned. And I think the Forestry Commission are already starting in a good direction on that. Yeah. And the bodies like the Forestry Commission and the other European similar agencies also need to be making increased use of this Earth observation type approach as to how to manage it.
Now, this is an interesting question. Photovoltaic panels convert sunlight into usable energy much more efficiently than growing biomass does. Isn't that a very strong argument against biofuels?
Well, again, that's a good issue. During my days in the Forestry Commission, we looked at all options because remember, the Forestry Commission is the largest land user in Britain and landowner, and we looked around at all the opportunities as to what alternative energy we could produce, whether it was hydropower, whether it was light, whether it's wind power. And the conclusion we came to, it depends what people want to actually use the land for, but how they might be encouraged. We need a mixture. Now there is a place for biofuel. I have to confess, I use a very modern wood burner, which is very low on emissions, and there is a place for wood fuel. But in terms of our total energy package, this is again where we need sensible evidence-based policy as to how we move forward. There will be I'm not suggesting for one moment we go down a wood fuel to replace all these other alternative sources of energy. But there will be a niche for it.
Absolutely, biofuel does have a place. Now, Jim Radcliffe, the founder of Ineos Petrochemicals, recently spoke on Bloomberg about how carbon taxes in the UK and the EU have made it uncompetitive for business. Now, of course, he would, but how can we actually ensure that governments stay the course? How can we make the case for effective taxation and policy on carbon reduction and biodiversity?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's a really good point. It's been really frustrating that I know plenty of people working in the city that have been frustrated with the whole carbon market situation. We have carbon markets, but they have not developed in the way in which a lot of us would like to see. Um, we need to have much greater evaluation, following that slightly tragic Panorama program where Vera was heavily criticized. There's always going to be the potential for that. But the opportunity, that shouldn't mean that we walk away from it. Now, in terms of, we've got the national policy, I've spent a lot of time with the World Bank. The World Bank are really keen to get these things going, and there's various other agencies which you can feed into the World Bank. But they're not going to move until we can ensure that it's ultimately going to be in country. And so we need to set the lead in the UK, and we need to help overseas governments as well as to how we develop that policy. There's not simple, but it's all doable. I mentioned the CO2 eco type view. That's certainly a type of policy that could work, providing everything is done really honestly.
Now, this is an interesting question, and it boils down to the conflict of interest between people who live on land and people who want to see that land managed effectively for biodiversity and carbon capture. Who ultimately owns and controls the land in the examples that you gave in your talk, for ecotourism, etc.? What's the legal relationship involved in how that land is structured?
Yeah, well, ultimately, the view that you would take, I think, at the international level, during my days on the board of EFI, European Forest Institute, when we developed the FLEC program, we did that on behalf of the European Union. And all the agreements that were signed, and during my time, I think we signed about 16 agreements. It was always a co-signature between the President of the European Union and the President of the country. That's the sort of level that you need to start at to get real credibility. Having done that, you've then got to deliver. So this is where you can effectively engage with commercial organizations to make sure that I mentioned the opportunity in Uganda, for example, on the ecotourism there. You need people involved that know how to develop these SMEs, small, that can start up alongside the forest situation, that are pertinent to the area, which includes the production, for example, of pharmaceuticals, small startup and vaccines and things that can all come in as part of that community. But unless you've got the fundamental agreement at the national level and it's enforceable, the management, so you've got the signature, from the president of the country. The work in Uganda, for example, I've been there myself before, and we're working with, I'm talking to the justice minister, for example. These are the types of levels that we need to ensure that we can get effective delivery.
Absolutely, and there's a fascinating question here which raises the issue of master land use planning. This is a sadly neglected discipline, and do you think it's something that should be given greater prominence? Should land use planning be given the same status as economics within governments to ensure that we can deliver on biodiversity and ensure that a country's natural capital is protected and available for exploitation as well?
That's absolutely essential in terms of the way we move forward. Um, for example, I mean, I have not mentioned that much, just in passing, the issue of food and feed. I know, I think one of my colleagues from Surrey, Sue Lanham-New, who's the head of nutrition at Surrey, we've spoken about this a lot, I've heard for a long time, in terms of our food supply and what we should be eating. Land use planning inevitably goes into diet and nutrition as well. We need a much more holistic approach. Can we really afford to eat the amount of beef? One of the problems that we have in Amazonia, for example, is the clearance of forest for soya production to produce beef. Now, at both the national and the international level, should we be supporting the same degree of meat production as we have at the moment? So land use has to be a key issue as we move forward. If we're going to reach the sustainability goals and have a really truly sustainable planet, land use has to be at the center of it.
Okay, we've got the $1 million question here. What can we do as individuals in our lives to help?
Well, that's a great question as well, because we can do it at whatever level you want. It can be in whatever local community, whether it's a church community. I think the church has a big role to play in trying to put this message over. It's one group of people, but we have in an area I live on the south coast and near Arundel, we have groups in the local community that meet together to try and see some way we can do it collectively. You stand much more chance if you get people to share experience. So there's a massive amount of opportunity. I've been really quite impressed. I was rereading yesterday some of the Pope's messages. The Pope has been a great supporter as the leader of the Catholic Church in how he wrote his document Louder to See on the common home, on how we can live more sustainably. And in terms of land use becomes a key part of this. So I think it can be at any level. It can be social groups locally, it can be families, it can be anything. We all need to be talking more as to how we're going to have a sustainable future for our grandchildren particularly.
Right. The last question, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, is can you recommend a good book to read? This questioner, their own interest is in aquifer management in Africa. Crop management and satellite observation is key to this. Can you recommend a book in this area?
It's always a difficult one when you've just written a book yourself.
Go on, recommend your own book,
In the
Jim.
back of that, you will see that I give lots of further reading, and because what's happening at the moment is there are some really quite good books being produced in this area. You've only got to Google now which are going to be the best ones to read. I tell you one book which I found absolute. I get lots of books sent to me. I review for the Royal Society of Biology. There's one book called Wilding and that's for the UK. Isabella Tree. She did a small book, but she's now done a thick practical guide. Wilding, I haven't mentioned much about that, but in the UK that becomes quite an important feature. So there's a lot beginning to come out. I look at the monthly list coming out, and there's some real opportunities in the books that are there.
Now I'm getting desperate signals that we're running out of time here, but I just do want to plant a seed for our audience. It strikes me there may be a novel way of investing in biodiversity. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of fuss about cryptocurrencies, but the problem with cryptocurrencies is they're very volatile and can change value in a matter of minutes. One way around this is to develop something called stable coins, which are linked to real world fiat assets such as sovereign bonds. How about a stable coin that is linked to a hectare of rainforests? Governments could generate foreign direct investments, the forests would be protected, and a new class of digital asset would be created. But no time to talk about this. I'm afraid that time has caught up with us, ladies and gentlemen. I know that some of you have still got questions to ask, and I do apologise if we haven't got round to you. We will be passing all questions on to Jim, and Jim will answer you directly. If you have any further questions, email us and we will pass your questions on. Just remains for me to thank our speaker for their presentation, and to your audience for your excellent contributions to today's discussion. I would also urge you to keep an eye on forthcoming events. We've got a truly eclectic mix of webinars coming up, which include Is ESG Dead? An investigation of investor returns on the 9th of July. Pan-Livery Legacy, from historical philanthropy to modern rehabilitation with no going back, on the 11th of July. Digital Care, Are We There Yet? On the 10th of July. Is Big Tech Taking Over Our Money? On the 16th of July, and Unlocking Neurodiversity in Insurance and Investment on the 17th of July. You can catch up with all of these as well as our previous webinars on our website and on our YouTube and LinkedIn channels. We do hope that we're going to see you again soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.